All right, my friends, we are going to go through what I'm calling the English 1020 final exam practice run. And this is a past 1020 final exam, a real past exam that students were given in a past semester, and it will show you what the real deal is going to be like. Obviously, the real final will be a completely different story, and the question that you're asked or the prompt that you're given may be completely different, but this will help you to get the idea of what the final will be like. So if you want to follow along with me, and I strongly suggest that you do, go to content and then to final exam materials over in the left hand sidebar and click on English 1020 practice run. So you'll see there English 1020 final, read the short story and respond to the prompt below. So here is the prompt that you're considering for this practice run. In a well-developed paragraph, discuss two of Mademoiselle Arlie's character traits. So the general instructions and reminders are, this says that you have 1 hour, but actually in an online situation, you would have more time than that. Treat this response like a body paragraph with a topic sentence. Now, this is the thing about the final for 1020 that can throw people off. The good news is you're only writing a paragraph. You're not writing an entire paper. The bad news is you're only writing a paragraph. You're not writing an entire paper. So if you mess it up, then obviously messing up one little thing in a paragraph is not like messing up one thing in a whole paper where you've done a bunch of other things right. So you've got to get it right. So you're not beginning with a hook. No, you're not beginning with a traditional intro. Rather, you are starting out with a topic sentence. You do not need a separate introductory paragraph. You just have one paragraph, no introductory information whatsoever, right? What you do is you indicate the author's full name and the title in your very first sentence. That's what you're going to do. So next, you're going to develop your paragraph with details and analysis. You have to quote at least one time from the short story and give a correct parenthetical citation in MLA formatting. You can quote other words and phrases from the excerpt if you wish, but most of the words in the paragraph must be your own. So certainly you could quote maybe twice, but you want to make sure that you cite after the quote and that you do it correctly. So this says, upon completion, turn in your copy of the short story with your completed paragraph, but obviously what we would be doing is submitting it into assignments in Brightspace under the final exam. So you see the title here, Regret by Kate Chopin, but when you actually use her title, you'll place it in quotation marks every time you use it, because that's not your title, that's her title. So if in your title you say an analysis of regret, you've got to put that word regret, which is her title, in quotation marks. Mademoiselle Arlie possessed a strong, good figure, ruddy cheeks, hair that was changing from brown to gray, and a determined eye. She wore a man's hat about the farm and an old blue army overcoat when it was cold, and sometimes top boots. Mademoiselle Arlie had never thought of marrying. She had never been in love. At the age of 20, she had received a proposal, which she had promptly declined, and at the age of 50, she had not yet lived to regret it. So she was quite alone in the world except for her dog Ponto and the Negroes who lived in her cabins and worked her crops, and the fowls, a few cows, a couple of mules, her gun with which she shot chicken hawks, and her religion. So we know so far that our main character is Mademoiselle Arlie, and forgive me that my French is horrific. I have never taken French. I took Spanish, but never took French. So pardon me if I horribly butcher these words. We know that this is taking place in a much earlier time, and we know that if we know anything about Kate Chopin, you know that she lived in the 19th century. during the time of slavery. So some of the terminology that we're hearing lets us know that fact. One morning, Mademoiselle Arlie stood upon her gallery, contemplating with arms akimbo a small band of very small children who, to all intents and purposes, might have fallen from the clouds. So unexpected and bewildering was their coming, and so unwelcome. So if you come across a word that you're not real sure what it means, like akimbo, you want to look it up, and you can do that. They were children of her nearest neighbor, Odalie, who was not such a near neighbor after all. The young woman had appeared but 5 minutes before, accompanied by these 4 children. In her arms she carried little Elodie. She dragged Tinomi by an unwilling hand, while Marceline and Marcelette followed with irresolute steps. Her face was red and disfigured from tears and excitement. She had been summoned to a neighboring parish by the dangerous illness of her mother. Her husband was away in Texas. It seemed to her 1,000,000 miles away. And Valcine was waiting with a mule cart to drive her to the station. "It's no question, Mademoiselle Arlie. You just got to keep those youngsters for me till I come back. Do said I would not bother you with them if there was any other way to do. Make 'em mind you, Mademoiselle Arlie. Don't spare 'em. Me there I'm half crazy between the children and Leon not home, and maybe not even to find poor Maman alive encore." A harrowing possibility which drove Odalie to take a final hasty and convulsive leave of her disconsolate family. So we're hearing that Cajun accent, which I'm doing very poorly. So we know, if you know anything about Kate Chopin, she wrote a lot about Louisiana, because that's an area where she lived. She left them crowded into the narrow strip of shade on the porch of the long, low house. The white sunlight was beating in on the white old boards. Some chickens were scratching in the grass at the foot of the steps, and one had boldly mounted and was stepping heavily, solemnly, and aimlessly across the gallery. There was a pleasant odor of pinks in the air, those are flowers, and the sound of Negroes' laughter was coming across the flowering cotton field. So we are definitely in the time of slavery. And notice that that African Americans are referred to as Negroes, which is rather disturbing, but that's because of the time in which this was written. Mademoiselle Aurélie stood contemplating the children. She looked with a critical eye upon Marceline, who had been left staggering beneath the weight of the chubby Elodie. She survived with the same calculating air Marcelette, mingling her silent tears with audible grief and rebellion of Tinomi. During those few contemplative moments, she was collecting herself, determining upon a line of action which should be identical with a line of duty. She began by feeding them. So we've got this old maid who's never been married. She's never had children. We would have called her an old maid back in East Ridge. And suddenly she's in charge of these 4 children. She doesn't know what to do, and she finds them rather annoying. If Mademoiselle Aurélie's responsibilities might have begun and ended there, they could easily have been dismissed, for her larder was amply provided against an emergency of this nature. Her larder meaning like her provisions of food, her pantry. But little children are not little pigs. They require and demand attention which were wholly unexpected by Mademoiselle Aurélie, and which she was ill prepared to give. She was indeed very inept in her management of Odalie's children during the first few days. How could she know that Marcelette always wept when spoken to in a loud and commanding tone of voice? It was a peculiarity of Marcelette's. She became acquainted with Tinomi's passion for flowers only when he had plucked all the choicest gardenias and pinks for the apparent purpose of critically studying their botanical construction. "'Tain't enough to tell him, Mademoiselle Aurélie," Marceline instructed her. "You got to tie him in a chair. It's what Maman all the time do when he's bad. She tie him in a chair." The chair in which Mademoiselle Aurélie tied Tinomi was roomy and comfortable, and he seized the opportunity to take a nap in it, the afternoon being warm. At night, when she ordered them one and all to bed, as she would have shooed the chickens into the hen house, they stayed uncomprehending before her. What about the little white nightgowns that had to be taken from the pillow slip in which they were brought over, and shaken by some strong hand till they snapped like ox whips? What about the tub of water which had to be brought and set in the middle of the floor, in which the little tired, dusty, sun-browned feet had every one to be washed sweet and clean? And it made Marceline and Marcelette laugh merrily. The idea that Mademoiselle Aurélie should for a moment have believed that Tinomi could fall asleep without being told the story of, and I won't even attempt these French pronunciations of these stories, or both, or that Elodie could fall asleep at all without being rocked and sung to. I tell you, Aunt Ruby, Mademoiselle Orly informed her cook in confidence, me, I'd rather manage a dozen plantations than 4 children. It terrassant, bonté, don't talk to me about children. Tain't expected such as you would know everything about 'em, Mademoiselle Orly. I see that plainly yesterday when I spied that little children playing with your basket of keys. You don't know that makes children grow up hard-headed to play with keys? Does it make 'em teeth look too hard in a looking glass? Them's the things you got to know in raising and management of children. Mademoiselle Aurelie certainly did not pretend or aspire to such subtle and far-reaching knowledge on the subject as Aunt Ruby possessed, who had raised 5 and buried 6 in her day. She was glad enough to learn a few little mother tricks to serve the moment's need. Tinomi's sticky fingers compelled her to unearth white aprons that she had not worn for years, and she had to accustom herself to his moist kisses, the expressions of an affectionate and exuberant nature. She got down her sewing basket, which she seldom used, from the top shelf of the armoire, and placed it within the ready and easy reach which torn slips and buttonless waists demanded. It took her some days to become accustomed to the laughing, the crying, the chattering that echoed through the house and around it all day long. And it was not the first or second night that she could sleep comfortably with little Elodie's hot, plump body pressed close against her, and the little one's warm breath beating her cheek like the fanning of a bird's wing. What a great line. But at the end of 2 weeks, Mademoiselle Aurelie had grown quite used to these things, and she no longer complained. It was also at the end of 2 weeks that Mademoiselle Aurelie, one evening, looking away toward the crib where the cattle were being fed, saw Valsine's blue cart turning the bend of the road. Aurelie sat beside the mulatto, upright and alert. As they drew near, the young woman's beaming face indicated that her homecoming was a happy one. But this coming, unannounced and unexpected, threw Mademoiselle Aurelie into a flutter that was almost agitation. The children had to be gathered. Where was Tinomi? Yonder in the shed, putting an edge on his knife at the grindstone, and Marceline and Marcelette cutting and fashioning doll rags in the corner of the gallery. As for Elodie, she was safe enough in Mademoiselle Aurelie's arms, and she had screamed with delight at sight of the familiar blue cart which was bringing her mother back to her. The excitement was all over, and they were gone. How still it was when they were gone. Mademoiselle Aurelie stood upon the gallery looking and listening. She could no longer see the cart. The red sunset and the blue-gray twilight had together flung a purple mist across the fields and road that hid it from her view. She could no longer hear the wheezing and creaking of its wheels, but she could still faintly hear the shrill, glad voices of the children. She turned into the house. There was much work awaiting her, for the children had left a sad disorder behind them, but she did not at once set about the task of righting it. Mademoiselle Aurelie seated herself beside the table. She gave one slow glance through the room, into which the evening shadows were creeping and deepening around her solitary figure. She let her head fall down upon her bended arm and began to cry. Oh, but she cried, not softly as women often do. She cried like a man, with sobs that seemed to tear her very soul. She did not notice Ponto licking her hand. Kate Chopin wrote Regret on September 17, 1894. It was first published in Century in May 1895. It was reprinted in Chopin's second volume of short stories, A Night in Acadie, published in 1897. So the department is giving you that information so that you can use it to create your works cited entry for this piece. Now notice that in this example, you're not given page numbers. You probably will be in the real English 1020 final. But if for some reason you're not, you'll just count the pages. So if you're quoting from page 2, you would just have after the quote, in parenthesis, Chopin 2, in parenthesis, period, right? So think about the directions you've been given. Your job is to discuss 2 of her character traits. So the first thing you're going to do is to write that first topic sentence. And remember a long time ago, I believe in one of my videos, I talked about the idea, maybe this was in 1010, but I talked about the idea that whenever you're given a prompt, question, or instructions, it's a good idea to take the prompt and just regurgitate it back in the form of your sentence, right? And that regurgitate, that's a fancy word that just means vomit it back up. It's awful, I know, but regurgitate it back, echo it back. And so your topic sentence might look something like this. In Kate Chopin's regret, with the quotation marks, one may see that Mademoiselle Arlie possesses two important character traits, colon, and then you could name them, right? So as you're reading this, what do we know about Mademoiselle Arlie? What is she like? Well, we know that she's independent, right? She's lived all these years without a man. She's got a determined eye. She wears a man's hat. And this is back in a time of slavery, back in probably the 1850s, when that was not, the way that a woman would dress. She wears an old blue army coat and top boots like a man. She's never even thought about marrying or having children. She's never been in love. She did receive a proposal, but she turned it down. And she still didn't regret that. So she is a very independent, determined kind of lady. She's alone in the world, but it doesn't seem to bother her at all initially, right? And then all of a sudden, her neighbor asked her to babysit for a while. And it sort of comes out of the blue, and she's kind of annoyed, and she doesn't at first know what to do. And then we see Mademoiselle Arlie begin to change, right? She begins to realize, it's not enough to just feed them. They're not little pigs. They're actual children. They require these attentions which are wholly unexpected by Mademoiselle Arlie, and which she doesn't quite know how to give them. And she begins to learn about what the children need, that if she speaks to Marcelette in a big, loud, commanding tone, it's going to make her cry. And that Tinomi is passionate about flowers. So Tinomi picked all the best of flowers in the garden. But Mademoiselle Arlie can't quite get upset with him because he's so excited about them. So we see her beginning to change. And when she tries to just shoo them off to bed, they just stand there like, what? Wait, you got to get our nightgowns and wash our feet and read us a story? And she's like, what? You got to rock us? You got to sing to us? So she goes to Aunt Ruby, who is obviously one of the African-American enslaved people on her plantation, and asks Aunt Ruby for advice. And so she knows she doesn't have the knowledge that Aunt Ruby has, but she learns a few little mother tricks from Aunt Ruby. And eventually she gets to the point where she's used to the laughing and the crying and the chattering, and Elodie, pressed against her, and feeling that Elodie needs that security of being near her. And all of a sudden she's not complaining about it anymore. And right about the time that she gets used to these things and she starts to really appreciate them, the children's mother returns. And Mademoiselle Arlie is thrown into a flutter that is almost agitation, we're called. So she's not real happy that their mother has come back. She doesn't quite want to admit it. And all of a sudden, it's very, very still on that gallery, that big porch of that plantation house, when they're gone. And she turns into the house, and she sits down, and she cries. So she goes from being this very independent woman who doesn't even want marriage or children to being a person who has deep regret of not having had those things, right? So those are two of her big character traits, independence and regretfulness. And you might find some others, but if you were going to write about that, that's what you would probably choose. And you would find 2 quotes, at least, to support her independent, determined nature, and then the way in which she changes and becomes regretful that she did not marry and have children of her own. And notice how it all ties back to the title, regret. That title is giving you a clue, a big time clue about what the theme is of this piece and what one of the characteristics of Mademoiselle Arlie will be. So you're going to write that body paragraph, and it's going to be a fairly substantial paragraph, not just a little short one. You know, you want it to be fairly substantial, and then you're going to create your works cited page. So I wish you all the luck in the world with the final exam, and it may not be as long as the story, it may not be as complex as the story with the dialect going on, the vernacular as we would call it. We don't know what it's going to be, but hopefully this gives you a sense of that final exam and is helpful to you. Thank you so much for all your patience this semester and for your hard work. I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate you hanging in there with me and being my students.